Today I want to just talk a little bit about some story stuff before we get going on the gaming. So I want to talk about comic relief and the importance of comic relief, and really, like, what is comic relief, and should you have comic relief in a story? Do you need comic relief in a story? So comic relief is basically jokes or silly or funny things that occur in what would be considered an otherwise serious story. So if you're watching a Jim Carrey movie, like Ace Ventura or something, that's not comic relief. Rather, that's just comedy. That's just straight comedy. It's not really comic relief at all. So keep that in mind when you are thinking about inserting comic relief. If you are already writing a comedy, you probably don't need to have comic relief. In fact, you probably need the opposite, which is gravitas within a comedy story. So comedies kind of invert what I'm talking about. I think a really great example is, again, Star Wars. Especially, not even the first trilogy, but the entire 6 movies of Star Wars use comic relief a lot. In fact, it's something you see in lots of George Lucas movies. You see it in lots of Steven Spielberg movies as well. Both of those guys really knew the importance of making sure you have some sort of comic relief. When you have a serious story or a scary story, a story that is dramatic or evoking of, say, certain emotions that are considered negative, like fear or sadness, having moments where the audience can laugh provides an outlet for what are otherwise overwhelming or unpleasant feelings. If a movie makes you feel sad from beginning to end, a lot of people will come away from that really not feeling good about the movie. In fact, it's very difficult to make a movie that has a melancholic mood throughout and will leave you feeling good at the end, unless you're able to use some of what I'm talking about here, which is comic relief. But if you look at the original Star Wars movies, they're played very straight. All 6 of them are played really straight, whether you're looking at the original trilogy or the prequel trilogy. But they're full of comic relief. And so if you look at the first movie, what you have in terms of comic relief is the movie really begins with a very serious scene. Darth Vader breaking into the ship and killing people. And the next thing that you get are these silly droids. So C-3PO, the anxious android, is really present to provide comic relief for all the gravitas of the story. So the story has like very serious consequences. Planets blowing up. There's a planet that gets blown up in the course of the original Star Wars movie. And so C-3PO is there to joke, fine, I'm going my way. So most of the things that he does are silly. Same thing with R2-D2. R2-D2 is more of almost like a Three Stooges kind of physical comedy character. He literally emotes with woo, woo, woo. He does his little whistles and stuff like that, and those are his like emotes, if you will, for whatever he happens to be doing. It's really, really effective in that original trilogy. And you also have Han Solo. And so Han Solo is really a bad boy kind of character. He's a character that has a lot of serious things going for him, but he's also joking a lot, and that's why he's very appealing. He's a handsome man, he's a dangerous man, but he also jokes a lot, and those jokes provide a lot of relief for otherwise tense situations. So when the garbage compactor is going to smush them, we're all going to get a lot thinner, right? Things like that. That's part of the comic relief that is present in Star Wars. So if you were to take the serious situation out, it's why Star Wars parodies often don't work, in my opinion, is because Star Wars is actually full of comedy. There are so many funny things happening in Star Wars that it's difficult to parody. It's like doing a parody of Men in Tights. Like, Men in Tights is itself a parody. Star Wars, because it contains so much comedy, you can make parodies of it, but the parodies, to me, often fall flat because Star Wars, while it has the very straight playing story, is so full of this comic relief that I don't think it ends up working all that well for parody. If you look at the prequel trilogy, you primarily have in the first movie Jar Jar Binks as a comic relief character. He's a bumbling buffoon. He is taking the place of both R2-D2 and C-3PO. He's saying things that are silly. He's doing things that he does physical comedy. He gets his like tongue shocked and his tongue is like numb. And it's a bunch of little comic relief because the actual story of The Phantom Menace is very straight and very serious. So I think Star Wars is a great example of that, but you'll have it in Indiana Jones. You have it in a lot of the stuff that George Lucas is involved with, because I think George really understands the power of these two seemingly opposite things. And the reason comic relief works is that laughter is a thing which is generated by pain. You stop and think about it. You're like, well, I like to laugh. You like to laugh because it relieves pain. Laughter is generated from what would be negative emotions or situations that might evoke negative emotions. But it's a sense of mocking of them. By mocking those, it becomes a release for those negative emotions. And just a little anecdote from my past, I did a piece that was, I'm hesitant to call it musique concrète because it includes actual instruments and music, not just sounds that have been turned into a soundscape like Jonathan Chowning or maybe Morton Subotnick or some of these other musique concrète artists. Of course, Morton Subotnick has done lots of other kind of stuff as well. But I had these 4 different moods. So I created these pieces based on these 4 different moods that you basically have, 4 different basic emotions: sad, mad, glad, scared. So it was a 4 movement musique concrete-ish piece. And so I had this friend of mine come in, and I had her record a bunch of stuff. So I recorded her laughing, crying, screaming, and I don't remember. So anyway, I had her recording different things that like are related to this. Well, I felt like during the sad part, the crying part, I didn't quite have enough sounds. So I just put the laughter on there. And you couldn't tell the difference between the laughing and the crying when they were both happening at the same time. That's because they're very close, and because the context of the piece, because things sounded so sad, because the sounds I used were so grim otherwise to support the voice, it just all sounded like crying. Likewise, I could put the crying in the laughter track, and you couldn't tell that someone was crying on that track. So laughing and crying sound so similar that if you play them at the same time, they can really sound like this exact same thing. So when you laugh, think about how a comedian tells a joke. A comedian tells a joke about, if maybe you're watching a Brian Regan skit, he tells a joke about how he went to the hospital, right? He's like, I had the stomach thing and went to the hospital. No, that's a relaxing drive. Merge, everybody merge. That's his bit. Now, in reality, that's a pretty awful and like stressful situation, right? To try to drive yourself to the hospital when you're very sick. Why is that funny? Well, it's funny because having already passed through that pain, we can now look back at it and laugh and mock, and it provides a release for what would otherwise be an extremely tragic thing. I have to drive myself to the hospital while I'm throwing up on myself. Things like that. So that's really what I'm talking about with comic relief, is that in intense situations, laughter provides a release of the intense emotional buildup. Another really, it's a good example, and in some cases a bad example, and that's why I want to bring it up. Another good one is the Marvel franchise, the MCU, the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Now this takes cues from the comics themselves, because Stan Lee understood this as well. Stan Lee understood the importance of comedy. If you read Spider-Man comics in particular, it's in all of them. It's in X-Men and stuff like that. You'll notice that the characters do these little one-liners. They do these quips. They do these jokes all the time. And that is because in a comic format, it's supposed to be fun. And so if you're going to tell a serious story, you have to include lots of little jokes. So Spider-Man has all of these little one-liners. Stick around, or they have that. That's Predator, right? Where Arnold throws the knife into the guy and it's like stick around. That's comic relief. So the comics were full of it, and of course the MCU is full of it. But I feel like in a lot of MCU movies, you'll notice that there's a line that's crossed where they forget why they're telling the jokes. So the movies end up so full of snark. They end up so full of jokes. They end up so full of comic relief that the comic relief is no longer a comic relief. It's just kind of cruel snarkiness for no reason. It becomes too much. it no longer becomes a relief from the tense emotions. Rather, the tense emotions are not really there, and then instead you just have people being snarky with each other. But you'll notice that they'll do that. There'll be a bunch of aliens coming down, and they're fighting them, and then there's a joke like Hulk smashes Loki or something like that, and the audience laughs. And that's because this is like a very intense climax. You don't know, is everybody going to die? Is the world going to be destroyed? You have all this uncertainty in the story. Well, that provides a little bit of relief from that tension. So kind of like I talk about how writing plot is like making music. You have tension and release, tension and release. Well, comic relief is a way to relieve the tension of the emotions that somebody's feeling without relieving the tension of the story. So we're still uncertain about the story outcomes, but we tell some jokes and people don't feel as tense as really the story should perhaps justify. So I think that that's actually a good one. It's James Cameron does it. A lot of your favorite directors, a lot of the directors that have directed big blockbuster movies that are designed to appeal to a lot of people, understand intuitively the importance of comic relief, and they put it in their movies. I think partly because as any art form goes on, it becomes self-referential. So the MCU starts to reference itself more than it creates new things. It starts to create snark because that's what the medium demands. Iron Man and all these other movies were full of snarky wit. In fact, that was an objection, I think, to the original Iron Man movies. Like, this isn't my Tony Stark. My Tony Stark from the comics is very dour all the time, and he doesn't make any jokes. Well, the people who made those MCU movies knew that you were going to need comic relief if you were going to tell this very serious story. And the first Iron Man movie in particular is very serious. So you need that comic relief in order to relieve some of that tension, because the story carries so much tension in and of itself. It's such a stark situation in some cases. So that's my point. It starts to cross over the line, stops being comic relief and starts to be something that is just part of the style, and then it loses a lot of its effect. So that's comic relief. That's my Storycraft on comic relief. Should you put it in your stories? Well, it depends what kind of story you're writing. So I'll go back to the beginning. If you're writing a comedy, you actually want to create the inverse of this, and you'll notice it in a really, really good comedy. Will have, instead of having a bunch of comic relief in the climax, it has very serious moments in its climax. So really good one, a Jim Carrey movie is Liar Liar. Liar Liar is a silly movie almost the whole way through until we get to this critical part where, Jim Carrey is realizes he's a bad father and he's treated his family wrong and all these sorts of things. That sort of situation is really important because we haven't had a whole lot of that seriousness on the way. What we have in Liar Liar are, rather than comic relief, we have like sadness relief. So it's funny, funny, funny. Oh, but remember, this is actually pretty sad. Funny, funny, funny. Oh, remember, this is kind of sad. And then we have a climax that's really about things being sad, not things being funny, before we get back to the comedy and end with a lot of funny and uplifting sorts of feelings, that sort of thing. So anyway, I thought I would talk about that. Leave me your thoughts and let me know what you think about that. And we will go ahead and get to playing some games, and I'll check out the chat here as we go.